The massive hall fell into silence as the holographic screen came to life in the center of the room. Commander Zephyr stood tall before the gathered leaders of many different worlds, and his crystalline face showed the weight of 300 days of constant fighting. The war against the Devourers had taken everything from the Galactic Alliance, and now they were losing badly. Zephyr looked at the faces around him and saw the same exhaustion and fear that he felt in his own heart. They had fought with everything they had, but it was not enough, and everyone in that room knew it. The hologram showed the Tertian sector, and what remained of it after the last attack. Zephyr spoke with a voice that carried across the silent chamber, and told them that 40 billion lives were gone in less than one day. The number was too large to understand, but everyone tried anyway, because those were real people with real families and real dreams that would never come true now. Ambassador Lyra floated near the front of the room, and her body of pure light pulsed with waves of sadness that everyone could feel. She spoke next, and her voice was soft, but clear when she said that their military had nothing left to give and no more ships to send into battle. In the back corner of the great hall sat 3 humans who had been watching quietly since the meeting began. Captain John Bennett was a man in his 50s with gray hair mixed into the black and lines on his face that told stories of a life spent making hard choices. Next to him sat Dr. Lisa Morgan, who was the smartest scientist Earth had ever sent to the stars, and Lieutenant Kevin Price, who was their military expert and tactical advisor. They wore simple uniforms that looked plain compared to the beautiful clothes worn by the other species in the room. The humans had only been part of the galactic community for a short time, and most species still thought of them as primitive newcomers who barely knew how to fly between stars. John leaned forward in his chair and raised his hand to speak. His voice was calm and steady when he called out to Commander Zephyr and said that humanity might have something that could help win this war. The chamber turned to look at the humans, and some faces showed curiosity, while others showed doubt and even a little bit of contempt. Zephyr had grown to like these determined humans during their time together, and his face softened when he looked at John. He spoke kindly but honestly when he told the captain that Earth had barely achieved faster than light travel, and the Devourers would destroy anything humanity could send in mere seconds. John stood up from his chair, and Lisa activated the small crystal device she had been holding in her hand. The main hologram changed and now showed something floating in the darkness of deep space, far beyond Earth's solar system. It was a structure so massive that it took a moment for everyone to understand what they were seeing. Lisa began to speak, and her voice was strong and clear as she explained that 300 years ago, humanity had almost destroyed itself in a terrible war that they called the Final War. She told them about nuclear weapons and biological diseases, and energy weapons that could burn entire cities in moments. She said that humanity came within hours of killing every person on Earth, but Lisa continued and explained that in the years before that terrible war began, the smartest people on Earth saw what was coming and worked together on a secret project. They called it the Exodus Protocol, and it was humanity's last desperate attempt to save something of their species if the worst happened. The hologram zoomed closer, and everyone in the chamber gasped as they realized what they were looking at. These were not structures but ships, and there were thousands of them floating silent and dark in the empty space between stars. The vessels were enormous and built with sharp angles and heavy armor that looked nothing like the smooth, elegant ships that other species flew. Kevin stood beside his companions and spoke with pride in his voice when he said these were military warships built for one purpose only. He listed them off one by one and said there were dreadnoughts that stretched for kilometers and carriers that held hundreds of smaller fighters and destroyers and cruisers and support ships. He said there were over 5,000 capital ships plus thousands more support craft all waiting in the darkness. John added that when the final war ended and humanity stepped back from destroying itself, they had no use for these weapons anymore. They could not bring themselves to destroy the ships after putting so much work into building them, so they parked the entire fleet in a region called the Oort Cloud and sealed them away. Humanity called it the Ghost Fleet and tried to forget it existed. Ambassador, Lyra pulsed brightly with surprise and asked if humanity really built this massive fleet, using only chemical rockets and primitive fusion reactors. Lisa smiled, but there was no humor in it when she confirmed that yes, they built everything with technology that the galaxy considered crude and outdated. She explained that humans learned to be very efficient with limited resources because they had no choice. These ships were designed by people who knew they might die soon and wanted to make sure that if humanity had to fight, it would fight with overwhelming power. A reptilian council member named Thax hissed with skepticism and said that even if these ships really existed, they had been sitting unused for 300 years. He said they would be worthless now, just old relics that could not possibly work anymore. John's face became hard and serious when he responded that humanity maintained the fleet with automated systems and regular checks and preservation protocols. He said they made sure that if the Ghost Fleet was ever needed again, it would wake up ready to fight. And now humanity was offering every single ship to the Galactic Alliance to use in the war. The chamber exploded with voices arguing back and forth about whether to accept the human offer. Some saw hope for the first time in months, while others thought it was foolish to trust primitive technology. Zephyr raised his hand and the room fell silent again. He looked directly at John and his voice was heavy with concern when he said that the Devourers were unlike anything humans had ever faced. He explained that they did not negotiate or retreat, and they consumed entire worlds, leaving nothing alive behind them. He warned that if humanity committed this fleet to the war, many human lives would be lost. John met the commander's eyes without looking away and spoke with conviction when he said that Earth might be young compared to other civilizations, but humans understood sacrifice very well. He said humanity had been fighting and dying for causes greater than themselves since the very beginning of their history. He told Zephyr that if there was any chance to save billions of innocent lives, then humanity would take that chance without hesitation. Lisa stepped forward, and her voice was gentle but firm when she added that humans did not come to the stars just to hide when danger appeared. She said they came to be part of something bigger than one small world. Zephyr felt something unexpected rising in his chest, and it took him a moment to recognize the feeling as hope. These humans, with their outdated technology and primitive ships, were offering everything they had to defend species they barely knew. He spoke to the chamber and said the council would vote on accepting Earth's offer, but he warned John that activating the Ghost Fleet and moving it to the battle lines would take time they might not have. Kevin surprised everyone when he said that humanity already began waking up the ships 3 weeks ago, when they first received the Alliance's distress call. He said the Ghost Fleet would be ready to move in 10 days. The vote happened quickly because desperate times did not allow for long debates. When the results appeared on the hologram, it showed that every single council member voted yes. The Ghost Fleet would join the war. As the meeting ended and representatives began to leave, Zephyr walked over to the human delegation. He asked them quietly why they were doing this when Earth owed the Alliance nothing and could stay safely isolated from the war. John looked at the alien commander with eyes that had seen both the worst and best things humanity could do. He said it was simple, really, because that was just who humans were. He explained that humanity was far from perfect and had made terrible mistakes, but when innocent people were dying, humans could not turn away. He said they never had and never would. Zephyr felt his species' version of tears beginning to form in his eyes. In 200 years of military service, he had commanded beings from dozens of different species. But in this moment, facing these stubborn, brave humans, he felt his understanding of the universe change. Perhaps humanity's real strength was not their weapons or technology, but simply their refusal to abandon others no matter what it cost them. He reached out and took John's hand in the human gesture of respect that he had learned, and said they should prepare for what was coming. 10 days later, the Ghost Fleet would wake and the galaxy would learn what humanity built when they fought for survival. The Oort cloud was a frozen wasteland at the edge of humanity's solar system, where ice and rock drifted in eternal silence. For 300 years, the Ghost Fleet had floated here in the darkness, waiting for a call that most people thought would never come. But now command signals pulsed through the emptiness, and the ancient warships began to wake from their long sleep. Deep inside each vessel, computers that had been built by people, long dead, started running through activation sequences and checking systems that had not been used in centuries. Captain John Bennett stood on the bridge of the UNS Defiance and watched as his crew worked at their stations, bringing the massive ship to life. The flagship was a Titan-class dreadnought that stretched 4 kilometers from front to back, and every surface was covered in thick armor plating. The interior was nothing like the beautiful ships that other species flew with their smooth curves and soft lighting. Everything here was built from steel and titanium, with sharp angles and harsh lights and manual controls covering every wall. It looked crude and primitive, but it was built to survive anything and hit back twice as hard, Lieutenant Amy Zhang called. out from the engineering station and reported that Reactor 4 was coming online and all fusion cores were running stable. Kevin Price watched the tactical screens as ship after ship throughout the fleet reported they were ready for combat. He said that 80% of the fleet was operational now, and the remaining 20% would need another 2 days for complete system checks. Lisa Morgan stood next to John reviewing data on her tablet and reading off the numbers that made up their fighting force. She said they had 4,000 combat-ready vessels, including 12 Dreadnoughts and 65 carriers and 300 cruisers and 800 destroyers plus all the support ships and frigates. John nodded and rested his hand on the captain's chair, which was just a reinforced seat with basic controls built into the armrests. The Defiance had been designed during humanity's darkest hour when engineers built everything with one goal in mind, which was overwhelming firepower and the ability to survive damage that would destroy any normal ship. He turned to the young communications officer, whose name was Ryan Hall, and told him to open a channel to every ship in the fleet. Ryan's fingers moved across his console and he reported that all vessels were listening and waiting. John took a deep breath because he had been thinking about this moment for weeks, but now that it was here, he felt the full weight of what they were about to do. 50,000 crew members were scattered across these ancient ships, and every single one of them had volunteered knowing they might never see Earth again. He began speaking and his voice was steady when he said this was Captain John Bennett calling all vessels of the Ghost Fleet. He told them that 300 years ago their ancestors built these ships because humanity faced total extinction, and they built them hoping the weapons would never be needed. He said that today they were proving that hope was not wasted, but their mission was different than anyone had imagined back then. He paused and gathered his thoughts before continuing. He explained that they were not fighting for Earth's survival this time, but for species they had just met, and for worlds they had never seen, and for people who looked nothing like humans. He said some might ask why they were doing this, and the answer was simple: because it was the right thing to do. He told them that when you have the power to help others and you choose to do nothing, then you become part of the evil that follows. His voice grew stronger as he spoke about the Devourers who had killed 40 billion innocent beings, who just wanted to live and love and raise their children in peace. Across the fleet, in crew quarters and on bridges, humans stopped what they were doing and listened to their captain's words. Some were veterans who had served in Earth's small defense force, while others were civilian volunteers who had technical skills the fleet needed. There were engineers and pilots and gunners and medical staff, and all of them had made the choice to crew these warships that most of the galaxy considered obsolete. John continued speaking, and said he would not lie to them because the Alliance had warned that the Devourers were unstoppable, and that human technology was outdated, and that they were outmatched in every way. He admitted that maybe the Alliance was right about all of that, but then his voice filled with determination when he reminded them that humanity had a long history of doing impossible things. He said humans had climbed the highest mountains and crossed the widest oceans and split the atom and touched the stars, and they did all of it through determination and cleverness. On the engineering deck of the UNS Titan's Wrath, Commander Greg Foster listened with his team as the captain's speech echoed through the ship. Greg had spent the last week personally inspecting every power coupling and every weapon system and every armor plate on his Dreadnought. He muttered to his chief engineer, Lieutenant Patricia West, that the captain was right because they might be old, but they were not useless. Patricia smiled and pulled up the ship's weapons display on her screen. She listed off what they had, which was 16 heavy rail cannons and 42 missile pods and 30-point defense systems and 1 experimental plasma lance that had never been fired. She said she would like to see the Devourers try to ignore that kind of firepower. Back on the Defiance, John was finishing his speech to the fleet. He told everyone that in a few hours they would jump to Alliance space and link up with Commander Zephyr's forces and take the fight directly to the enemy. He admitted that some of them would not make it home because that was the reality of war, but every single person, whether they fell or survived, would know they stood up when they were needed. He said they did not hide, and they did not run away, and they chose to fight for something bigger than themselves. He looked around his bridge and saw determination on every face when he told them that humanity's greatest strength was not their weapons or their ships, but their refusal to give up or accept defeat or let evil win unopposed. He told the Ghost Fleet to prepare for the jump because they were going to war and they were going to show the galaxy what humans were made of. The channel closed and the bridge crew immediately went back to their stations, working with renewed purpose. Lisa approached John and her face showed both pride and worry at the same time. She said it was a good speech, but she hoped he was right about their chances of success. John managed a small smile and told her he had studied every report about the Devourers that Zephyr had provided. He said the enemy was fast and numerous and nearly impossible to kill with conventional weapons, and human ships were slow and old, and completely outclassed in every technical specification. Lisa said that was not very reassuring to hear, but John continued and explained that the Devourers had never faced human military doctrine before because the Alliance fought with elegant, efficient tactics using precision strikes and minimal damage and careful resource management, because that was how civilized species waged war. Lisa raised an eyebrow and asked what humans did differently. John told her that humanity learned to fight in the mud, and sometimes survival meant throwing everything you had at the enemy, and not stopping until they were completely destroyed. He said these ships were not built for elegance but for overwhelming, brutal, relentless firepower that would keep coming no matter what. Kevin joined them at the tactical display and reported that the fleet was forming up and they would be ready to jump in 3 hours. He explained that he had organized the ships into 5 battle groups with each one commanded by an experienced captain. He highlighted the formations on the screen and named them Battle Group. Alpha led by the Defiance and Battle Group Bravo under Commander Greg Foster, and Charlie Group with Captain Helen. Brooks and Delta Group under Commander Paul Martinez, and Echo Group with Captain Susan Clark. Lisa asked about the carriers, and Kevin explained that each battle group had 13 carriers that would deploy their fighter wings. He said they had 30,000 single-pilot craft, and each one was armed with enough missiles to level a city block. John studied the formation carefully and saw that it was aggressive and designed to maximize firing angles while providing overlapping defensive coverage. The Alliance might call it crude, but John knew it would be effective in actual combat. Ryan suddenly called out from the communication station and said he was receiving a message from Commander Zephyr. He reported that the Devourers had broken through the Meridian line and the Alliance was in full retreat, and Zephyr was asking when the Ghost Fleet would arrive. The bridge went completely silent as everyone absorbed this terrible news. The Meridian line was supposed to hold for at least another month, and if it had already fallen, then the Devourers were now close enough to strike at a dozen populated systems. John's jaw tightened, and he told Ryan to send a message back saying 72 hours, and they would jump in 3 hours and push their engines to maximum power. Amy warned from the engineering station that maximum power was beyond safe operating limits, and these reactors had not been tested under that kind of stress in 300 years. John replied that they would find out if their ancestors built these ships as tough as everyone thought, because if they did not get there in time, then millions more innocent people would die. Lisa placed her hand on his show. The Meridian Defense Station was breaking apart, piece by piece, as Commander Zephyr watched. From the bridge of his flagship, the Luminous Dawn, another explosion tore through the massive orbital platform, sending debris spinning into space, and Zephyr felt each loss like a physical blow to his chest. Around him, what remained of the Alliance fleet desperately tried to protect civilian transport ships while holding back the endless swarm of Devourers. He called for a status report, and his voice was tight with controlled desperation that he tried to hide from his crew. His tactical officer was a young Krillian named Nexus, who reported that 87 transport ships had escaped, but they had lost 15 more warships in the last hour alone. Nexus added with frustration in his voice that the Devourers were adapting to Alliance weapons faster than they could change their attack frequencies. Zephyr stared at the tactical display and felt horror growing inside him as he watched the enemy movements. The Devourers were unlike anything the galaxy had ever encountered before, because they seemed to be part biological and part mechanical, with sleek black shapes that moved through space like sharks hunting prey. Their weapons were devastating and used some kind of directed energy that simply unmade matter at the molecular level, leaving nothing behind. But what made them truly terrifying was their ability to learn and adapt, because every tactic the Alliance used and every weapon frequency and every defensive strategy was analyzed and countered within hours. It was like fighting an enemy that evolved in real time and got smarter with every battle. The communications officer suddenly announced that a Priority 1 message was coming in from the Earth fleet, and Captain Bennett reported they were 30 minutes away from arriving. Zephyr felt a small flicker of hope that was quickly crushed by reality and cold logic. He ordered his communications officer to broadcast on all channels that the human fleet should maintain a safe distance and provide support fire only and not engage directly until they could assess their capabilities against the Devourers. The officer hesitated and then reported that Captain Bennett had responded with a simple negative and the human fleet was coming in at full combat speed with no intention of holding back. Before Zephyr could respond, space itself seemed to tear open, right in front of them. The humans arrived not with the gentle ripples of normal, faster than light travel, but with brutal, violent exits that left temporary spatial distortions hanging in space like wounds. One moment there was empty darkness, and the next moment it was filled with 4,000 human warships appearing all at once. The Ghost Fleet emerged in perfect combat formation, with battle groups spreading across 3 dimensions in a grid pattern that surrounded the Devourer swarm from multiple angles. The ancient ships immediately began accelerating with their fusion drives burning at maximum output, pushing them forward with obvious aggressive intent. Ambassador Lyra was standing on the bridge of the Luminous. Dawn in her form of pure energy pulsed with surprise when she said they were not slowing down at all. Zephyr quickly pulled up a direct communication channel to the Defiance and asked Captain Bennett what he was doing because he needed to assess the enemy capabilities before engaging in combat. John's face appeared on the screen, looking calm despite the chaos of battle happening all around them. He said with respect that they had been assessing the Devourers for the last 72 hours using all the data Zephyr had provided, and they knew exactly what they were up against. Zephyr tried to explain that the humans could not possibly understand what they were facing, but John gently interrupted him. The captain said they appreciated the concern, but they did not come all this way just to watch the battle from a distance. He turned to someone off-screen and told Kevin to execute the attack plan they had prepared. On every human vessel throughout the fleet, weapon systems that had been sleeping for 3 centuries suddenly came alive with power. The Ghost Fleet opened fire all at once, and the galaxy learned in that moment why humanity had been afraid enough of these weapons to hide them away in the darkness. So, first attack came from the Dreadnoughts, and their massive rail cannons fired projectiles that weighed several tons each. The rounds were accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed using magnetic force, and when they slammed into the Devourer swarm, the kinetic energy was so immense that temporary fusion reactions occurred on impact. 16 Devourers simply ceased to exist in flashes of light because their biomechanical bodies could not adapt to the pure physics of mass times velocity. There was no energy signature to analyze and no frequency to counter because it was just solid matter moving very fast, obeying Newton's laws of motion. The Devourers reacted instantly with their swarm-breaking formation and beginning evasive maneuvers to avoid more impacts. They had adapted to fight against Alliance tactics, which used precision strikes and careful targeting of weak points. But they were completely unprepared for what the humans did next. The human destroyer ships opened fire with their missile pods and launched thousands of projectiles in massive waves. These were not smart missiles with sophisticated guidance computers, but simple, dumb warheads filled with chemical explosives designed to saturate entire areas with overlapping blast zones. Nexus said with confusion that the humans were wasting ammunition because those missiles could not possibly track individual targets. But then 300 Devourers flew directly into the missile swarm, apparently not recognizing the danger. The resulting explosions overlapped and created a cascading chain reaction that consumed everything in a sphere nearly 50 kilometers across. Zephyr suddenly understood what he was seeing and said out loud that the humans were not trying to track individual ships, but instead creating zones of destruction that filled space with fire. He realized the Devourers could not adapt to something that did not require adaptation because you cannot outsmart an explosion that fills all available space. Lisa's voice came over the command channel, which was now connected to Alliance command networks, and she explained that human military doctrine evolved from centuries of fighting wars in Earth's atmosphere. She said humans learned to fight in 3 dimensions where you could not always see your enemy clearly, so their solution was area denial and overwhelming firepower that left nowhere to hide. The carrier groups launched their fighter wings, and 30,000 small craft poured out of the hangar bays like angry insects swarming toward the Devourers. The biomechanical ships moved to intercept, feeling confident in their ability to destroy these primitive vessels. But they were very wrong about what was coming. The human fighters did not try to dogfight or engage in one-on-one combat. like Alliance pilots did. Instead, they formed up into tight squadrons and made high-speed attack runs where each craft dumped its entire missile payload in a single pass before breaking away at maximum acceleration. The Devourers adapted their energy weapons to target the small fighters, but by the time they achieved weapon lock, the human pilots were already retreating behind the protective screen of their capital. Ships and out of range, Ambassador Lyra pulsed with excitement and said it was brilliant because the humans were using tactics the Devourers had never encountered before. She explained that hit-and-run attacks with weapons too simple to counter effectively were confusing the enemy adaptive systems. But the Devourers were still learning from each engagement, and a group of 50 biomechanical ships broke away from the main swarm. They accelerated toward Battle Group Charlie, which was led by Captain Helen Brooks commanding. From the UNS Relentless, her tactical officer called out that multiple contacts were incoming on bearing 273, and they were focusing all their fire on the human battle group. Helen's expression remained completely calm, and she ordered all ships to shift to defensive pattern Delta and told them to set point defense systems to maximum power. The Devourers opened fire with their matter-disrupting weapons, and beams of violet energy shot across space. These weapons had torn through Alliance shields like they were made of paper. But when the beams hit the Relentless, something unexpected happened that nobody had predicted. The ship's armor ablated in layers with reactive plating designed to fragment and disperse incoming energy. It was crude and inefficient and created huge clouds of debris floating around the ship. But it worked perfectly because the Devourer weapons were designed to unmake solid matter, and now they found themselves hitting constantly changing surfaces. The fragmented layers shed the directed energy before it could penetrate deep enough to cause real damage. Helen ordered all batteries to return fire immediately. The Relentless and every ship in her battle group unleashed a devastating barrage that lit up the darkness. Heavy lasers and particle beams and plasma cannons and railguns and missile swarms all fired simultaneously, creating a storm of destruction. The Devourers tried desperately to adapt to the incoming fire, but there were too many different weapon types coming from too many attack vectors at once. 15 Devourers died in the first 10 seconds of the engagement, and their bodies broke apart into fragments. The survivors broke off their attack and retreated back toward the main swarm, clearly shaken by their losses. Aboard the luminous dawn, Zephyr watched in stunned silence as his tactical display updated with new information. In less than 27 days had passed since the Battle of Meridian, and the war had changed dramatically because the Ghost Fleet and Alliance forces, working together, had recaptured 3 entire star systems and were now pushing deep into space that the Devourers had controlled for months. But victory was coming at a terrible price that grew heavier with each passing day. Captain John Bennett stood in the medical bay of the Defiance, looking at the long rows of injured crew members lying in beds. He saw burns and radiation sickness and decompression injuries and knew that the Devourers were learning and adapting faster than anyone had anticipated or hoped. Dr. Lisa Morgan walked up to him, and her face showed the exhaustion that everyone felt after weeks of constant fighting. She reported quietly that they had lost another 112 personnel in just the last 48 hours alone. She explained that the Devourers had finally figured out how to modulate their weapons to punch through the ablative armor that had protected human ships so well in earlier battles. John said he knew because he read every casualty report that came across his desk, and each name felt like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. They walked together toward the strategic planning room where Commander Zephyr and the other fleet commanders were waiting for the next tactical meeting. The space station they were using as a forward operating base was a joint construction built hastily by both humans and Alliance species working side by side. It was not elegant, but it was functional, and that was all that mattered in wartime. Inside the planning room, holographic displays covered the walls showing current battle lines and enemy positions. All the human captains were present, including Greg Foster from the Titan's Wrath, and Helen Brooks from the Relentless, and Paul Martinez from the Steadfast, and Susan Clark from the Valiant. Standing with them were Zephyr and Ambassador Lyra, and several other Alliance commanders from different species. Zephyr began the briefing by pulling up new tactical data and explaining that the situation was evolving in dangerous ways. He said the Devourers had split their remaining forces into 3 major swarms, and the largest one was defending their shipyards hidden deep inside the Cronus Nebula. Intelligence reports suggested this was the location where they were building more of their kind and replacing their losses. Greg Foster leaned forward over the tactical display, and his weathered face was serious when he said that made the shipyards their primary target. He argued that if they cut off Devourer production, then they could stop this from becoming a war of attrition that humanity and the Alliance would eventually lose. A reptilian Thaxian commander named General Krath shook his head in disagreement. He explained that the nebula's particle density would disable most targeting systems, and their ships would be fighting blind against an enemy that could see perfectly well in those conditions. Kevin Price studied the holographic display carefully and suggested that they needed to change the conditions of the battlefield. He brought up a new screen showing the nebula's exact composition and pointed out that the density came from hydrogen and helium particles floating in space. An Alliance scientist interrupted and said that dispersing those particles would require a fusion reaction large enough to push against an entire nebula, and the energy requirements would be immense beyond anything they currently had available. Helen Brooks smiled grimly and suggested that they had 12 Dreadnoughts, and each one was powered by a fusion reactor that was considered oversized, even by human standards 300 years ago. She asked what would happen if they overloaded all 12 reactors in a carefully timed sequence. The room fell into complete silence as everyone present processed the implications of what she was suggesting. Paul Martinez voiced what they were all thinking when he said she was talking about using their most powerful ships as massive bombs, and that was basically a suicide mission for the crews involved. Lisa spoke up and said it was not necessarily suicide if they planned it correctly. She pulled up detailed engineering specifications and explained that if they rigged the reactors to vent their plasma through the weapons arrays before reaching critical failure, they could create a controlled cascade reaction. She said the Dreadnoughts would survive the process, but barely, and they would pump enough energy into the nebula to create temporary clear zones where normal sensors and weapons would work. Zephyr studied the plan carefully, and his crystalline features reflected the holographic light as he thought. He said this was extremely risky, and if even one reactor failed to vent properly, the entire ship would be destroyed instantly, killing everyone aboard. John spoke firmly and said it was their best option because the Devourers were getting smarter with every passing day. He argued that if they allowed the enemy to keep building new ships eventually, the Devourers would overwhelm them through sheer numbers alone. He said they needed to strike now while they still had any kind of advantage. Ambassador Lyra pulsed thoughtfully and said that Captain Bennett was correct in his assessment, but they also had to consider the human cost. She pointed out that humanity had already suffered more casualties in this conflict than all the rest of the Alliance species combined. Susan Clark spoke up, and her voice was steady despite the obvious exhaustion on her face. She said with all due respect that every person on these ships had volunteered, knowing full well what they were signing up for. She stated clearly that humans were not going to back down now when they were so close to ending this threat forever. The planning session continued for many hours as they hammered out details and prepared contingency plans for everything that could go wrong. Finally, Zephyr called for an official vote on whether to proceed with the operation. The plan was approved unanimously by everyone present. As the meeting broke up and people started to leave, Zephyr pulled John aside for a private conversation. He asked the captain why humanity continued to push so hard when his people had already given so much to this war. John looked at him and really looked at the alien commander, seeing the exhaustion and doubt in his eyes. He explained that on Earth they had a saying which was that evil triumphs when good people do nothing. He said the Devourers were evil in its purest form because they did not negotiate or compromise, but existed only to consume everything in their path. He told Zephyr that if they did not stop the enemy here and now, then the Devourers would keep spreading until there was nothing left in the entire galaxy. Zephyr asked at what cost to the human species, and John replied simply that the cost would be whatever it took because the alternative was completely unthinkable. 3 days later, the combined fleet approached the Cronus Nebula, which was a massive swirling cloud of gas and dust that stretched across light years of space. It was beautiful to look at, but also deadly because somewhere inside those clouds, the Devourers waited with their shipyards and what intelligence estimated to be over 5,000 biomechanical ships ready to defend their production facilities. The human Dreadnoughts moved into their assigned positions and formed a geometric grid around the nebula's main entrance. Inside each massive ship, engineering crews worked frantically to prepare the reactor overload sequence that would either save them all or kill them. On the Titan's Wrath. Greg Foster walked through the engineering deck, personally checking on his people and making sure everything was ready. The ship's chief engineer, Patricia West, was personally overseeing the dangerous reactor modifications. Greg asked how everything was looking, and Patricia wiped sweat from her forehead before replying that it looked like organized chaos. She said they were essentially turning a power plant into a directional bomb, and the margin for error was microscopic, with no room for mistakes. Greg told her with complete confidence that she could do this because he had seen her keep the ship running with nothing but duct tape and prayers. He said this was just another day at the office for someone with her skills. Patricia laughed despite the tension and said that duct tape and prayers had been the foundation of human engineering since the dawn of time aboard the Defiance. John stood on the bridge watching the countdown clock as it ticked toward zero. The Dreadnoughts would vent their reactor plasma simultaneously, creating 12 massive energy jets that would push into the nebula and temporarily clear away the particle density that blocked sensors. Ryan Hall announced from the communications station that all ships were reporting ready status. Kevin added that the Alliance fleet was standing by in position, ready to exploit the breach they were about to create. Lisa stood beside John and her hand unconsciously gripped the metal railing tightly. She said quietly that if this worked, it would be the largest coordinated energy release in all of human history. John asked what would happen if it did not work, and Lisa replied that they would have destroyed 12 of their most powerful ships for absolutely nothing. John said softly that it would not be for nothing because even if they failed, they would have shown the Devourers that humanity refused to give up. He said that sometimes showing that determination mattered more than actually winning. The countdown reached zero, and on 12 Dreadnoughts simultaneously fusion reactors began to overload in carefully controlled sequences. Plasma heated to temperatures that rivaled the cores of stars was channeled through weapons arrays that were designed to handle. 6 months had passed since the destruction of the Cronus shipyards, and the war had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. The Devourers had been denied their ability to build new ships, and now they had consolidated every remaining vessel into one massive swarm that moved through space like a dark plague. Intelligence reports estimated there were nearly 20,000 biomechanical ships in this final armada, which represented everything the enemy had left. They were heading directly for Earth with obvious hostile intent. Captain John Bennett stood on the rebuilt bridge of the Defiance, staring at the tactical display that showed the approaching enemy swarm. The Devourers were still 3 weeks away from reaching humanity's home system, but they were moving at maximum speed and ignoring every other potential target along their path. The message was painfully clear to everyone who saw it because humanity had wounded the Devourers badly, and now the enemy wanted revenge against the species that had dared to fight back. Kevin Price stood at his station and his voice was tight with barely controlled anger when he said they were going straight for humanity's home. World. Commander Zephyr's face appeared on the communication screen broadcasting from the luminous dawn, which was traveling in formation alongside the Ghost Fleet. He informed Captain Bennett that the Alliance Council had just authorized the deployment of their entire reserve fleet to make a final stand at Earth. John said quietly that Zephyr did not have to do this because it was not the Alliance's fight anymore. He explained that humanity had started this confrontation when they joined the war, and now they would finish it alone if necessary. Zephyr's crystalline features seemed to soften with emotion, and he said that 6 months ago humanity brought their fleet to defend worlds they had never even seen before. He asked if John really expected the Alliance to do any less now when humanity needed help. He stated firmly that humans had stood beside the Alliance when they faced total extinction, and now the Alliance would stand beside humanity. Ambassador Lyra's form of pure energy materialized on the bridge through a holographic projector, and she informed Captain Bennett that representatives from 47 different Alliance species had already arrived in Earth's solar system. She said they were calling this gathering the Pilgrimage of Gratitude, which was a term that confused the humans present. Lisa asked what exactly a pilgrimage meant in this context, and Lyra explained that these species had come to witness humanity's defense of their home world. She said many had brought gifts and supplies and advanced technology to help, but more importantly than material goods they had come to bear witness to what happened because if humanity fell defending Earth, then the galaxy wanted to remember what humans had stood for and what they had sacrificed. John felt a lump forming in his throat, and said he did not know what to say in response to such an honor. Zephyr replied that John should say he would allow the Alliance to help prepare Earth's defenses because they had 3 weeks to turn humanity's solar system into the most heavily defended location in the entire galaxy, and they should not waste a single moment. What followed was the most extraordinary construction effort in all of human history as ships from dozens of different species arrived, bringing weapons and shields and automated defense platforms, and most critically the accumulated knowledge of civilizations that had existed for thousands of years. Alliance engineers worked side by side with humans to upgrade every ship in the Ghost Fleet. With the best technology available, the Defiance received new shield generators that could adapt to enemy weapons, and its rail cannons were augmented with Alliance targeting systems that increased accuracy by orders of magnitude. The ship's armor was reinforced with special materials that could actually adapt to different types of energy weapons in real time. But the most remarkable development came from a completely unexpected source that nobody had anticipated. The Lumina Collective, which was Ambassador Lyra's species, had been studying human emotions extensively during their time working together, and they had discovered something extraordinary, Lyra explained, to a gathered council of human and Alliance leaders. That human determination and the sheer stubborn refusal to give up actually generated a measurable energy signature that their instruments could detect. She said they called it willpower in their own language, but for humans, it was something more powerful than simple determination. It was a kind of energy field that actually grew stronger when humans were under pressure and facing impossible odds. Lisa studied the scientific data with growing fascination and asked if they were saying that human consciousness itself generated some kind of field effect that could be measured. A Lumina scientist named Prism added that it was more than just a field because they believed they could actually harness this energy and convert it into something useful. He explained that with humanity's permission, they wanted to install special resonance amplifiers on all the human ships that would take that determination and willpower and convert it directly into physical shielding that could protect the vessels. Greg Foster, who was listening from the Titan's wrath, started laughing and said they wanted to power defensive shields with pure human stubbornness. He said that was the most human thing he had ever heard in his entire life. The new technology was installed across the entire Ghost Fleet, even though it was completely untested in actual combat conditions. Meanwhile, Earth's solar system was being transformed into a fortress as the asteroid belt became a massive minefield, and Jupiter's moons were converted into weapons platforms, housing enough firepower to destroy entire fleets. A defensive grid was established in orbit around Earth itself that incorporated defensive technology from dozens of different species all working together. But everyone involved in the preparations knew deep down that it still might not be enough to stop what was coming. They had 20,000 Devourers bearing down on them, and the defending force consisted of roughly 6,000 Alliance ships plus what remained of the Ghost Fleet, which was down to 3,200 vessels after months of brutal combat and heavy losses. On the night before the battle, John gave one final address to the combined fleet, and this time he spoke not just to humans, but to every species that had gathered to defend Earth. He began by addressing all ships and all crews, and all people who had gathered in this place. He said that tomorrow they would face an enemy that wanted to completely erase humanity from existence, and the Devourers had chosen Earth, specifically because they believed that destroying humanity's homeworld would break their spirit, and by extension break the spirit of the entire Alliance. He paused and looked around his bridge at the mixed crew of humans and aliens who were working together at their stations. He said the Devourers were wrong because they did not understand what they were really facing here. He explained that this was not just about defending Earth anymore, but about something much bigger than one planet. John's voice grew stronger as he continued speaking, and he reminded everyone that 6 months ago humanity had been alone and isolated and barely able to reach beyond their own solar system. Then they met all the species of the Alliance and learned they were part of something greater than themselves. They learned that the galaxy was filled with species who valued life and built civilizations and loved and dreamed and hoped for better futures. He said the Devourers thought they were attacking just one planet, but they were actually attacking an idea. The idea that different species from different worlds with completely different cultures could stand together united against darkness and evil. The idea that everyone was stronger together than they could ever be. divided and alone across the assembled fleet on ships representing 47 different species and cultures. The crews stopped their work and listened. Some understood John's words directly, while others relied on translation devices, but every single being present understood the meaning behind what he was saying. John told them that tomorrow, when the Devourers finally arrived, they were going to show the enemy exactly what that idea looked like in actual practice. He said they would demonstrate that when you threaten one world, you threaten them all, and they were going to make absolutely sure the Devourers regretted ever coming to this place. The Devourer swarm arrived at the edge of Earth's solar system exactly when the projections had predicted they would. They did not slow down or pause to assess the defenses, but simply accelerated straight toward Earth with single-minded determination and hatred. The battle began at Neptune's orbit, where Alliance ships used the ice giant's gravity well for tactical advantage and engaged the enemy vanguard. The Devourers had continued adapting during their journey, and their weapons were now capable of rapid frequency shifting that allowed them to counter most Alliance shield technology. But they encountered something unexpected, which was desperation combined with absolute unity of purpose. A Krillian cruiser with its shields completely failing made the decision to ram directly into a cluster of Devourers and sacrificed itself to destroy 15 enemy ships in the resulting explosion. A Thaxian fighter wing that had run out of ammunition used their own ships as weapons by overloading their fusion drives and creating massive explosions that scattered entire Devourer formations. The human ships, backed by Alliance technology and power,